Okay, so get ready, because we're diving headfirst into a topic that's both complex and, honestly, a little unnerving. Morality. We're talking about those big questions of right and wrong, good and evil, those ethical dilemmas that really make you think.
And to guide us through this labyrinth, pun
Yeah.
intended, we're using excerpts from a source that doesn't pull any punches, The Labyrinth of Morality.
I like it already. So where does this deep dive into morality begin?
Well, this source throws down the gauntlet right from the start. It asks us to imagine a world completely void of morality. No sense of right or wrong, no ethical compass, just complete anarchy.
Okay, yeah, that's a little terrifying, like something out of a dystopian movie. But it's also kind of brilliant, right? Because it forces you to confront that fundamental question, what is morality anyway?
Exactly. It's like we throw around these terms, right and wrong, good and evil, but what do they actually mean? And why should we even care?
Right, like is it all just subjective, or are there some universal truths about morality?
And that's where this deep dive gets really interesting. The source doesn't just ask these questions. It lays out a whole buffet of philosophical perspectives on morality.
Okay, I'm ready for this philosophical feast. What's on the menu?
Well, to start, we have absolutism. This perspective says that certain actions are always right or wrong, no matter what the context. It's about as black and white as it gets.
Okay, so no gray areas with absolutism, but we know the world is rarely that simple. What other perspectives does this source offer?
Well, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have relativism. This view suggests that morality is more like, well, a matter of taste. What's considered right or wrong can change drastically depending on your culture, your historical period, that sort of thing.
I can see that. I mean, things that were totally acceptable a few centuries ago might make us cringe today, right?
Exactly. And that's a key point of relativism. It highlights how fluid and dynamic moral values can be.
Okay, so we've got these two extremes: absolutism, where some things are always right or wrong, and relativism, where morality is more relative to culture and time period. But this source doesn't just leave it there, does it? I'm guessing there are more nuances to explore here.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And this is where the labyrinth of morality really starts to dig deep. It doesn't just present these different moral frameworks, it dissects them. It analyzes their strengths, their weaknesses, their potential pitfalls.
Okay, so let's talk about those pitfalls. What does the source have to say about the potential downsides of both absolutism and relativism? Because I have a feeling it's not going to let either one off the hook that easily.
You're exactly right. And this is where things get really interesting. Because while absolutism might sound appealing in its simplicity, it stumbles when you start considering how much our understanding of right and wrong has changed over time, even within the same society.
Yeah, if something is supposed to be inherently right, how can our perception of it shift so dramatically? It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. And then, with relativism, while it acknowledges the fluidity of moral values, the source raises the question of whether it can lead us down a bit of a slippery slope.
What do you mean?
Well, if everything is relative, does that mean there are no universal truths when it comes to morality? Can any action, even the most horrific, be justified by simply saying, well, that's just their culture?
That's a bit unnerving, to be honest. It makes you wonder if there's a middle ground, some sort of ethical balance between those two extremes. So if absolutism and relativism both have their downsides, what other options are on the table? What other moral flavors does this philosophical buffet have to offer?
Well, get ready for two more courses, each with its own unique flavor. First up, we have consequentialism. This perspective is all about judging actions based on their outcomes. Basically, the ends justify the means.
Okay, so it's not about following rules blindly. It's about considering the consequences of our choices. Sounds practical, but I can already see how things could get ethically murky pretty quickly.
Exactly. And the labyrinth of morality doesn't shy away from those gray areas. It dives right into those tough scenarios where the right choice isn't always clear. Like imagine a surgeon who has to choose between saving one life or letting 5 people die because there aren't enough organ donors.
Wow, talk about a moral dilemma. That's a tough one. Which way does consequentialism lean in a situation like that?
Well, a particularly intense flavor of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which aims to maximize happiness and minimize suffering for the greatest number of people. So in that surgeon scenario, A strict utilitarian would argue that saving the 5 lives is the more ethical choice, even though it means sacrificing one.
That makes sense in a cold, calculating sort of way, but it's hard to stomach, you know? Like, can we really put a numerical value on human life like that? It's like that thought experiment with the trolley. Do you sacrifice 1 life to save 5? How do you even begin to answer that?
Right. It highlights how even the most well-intentioned ethical frameworks bump into these really difficult paradoxes. And the source doesn't let us off the hook with easy answers, which I appreciate.
So, if consequentialism is about weighing the outcomes, what's the alternative perspective?
Well, that's where deontology comes in. This perspective kind of flips the script on consequentialism. It argues that some actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of their outcomes. It emphasizes things like duty, rules, moral principles, that sort of thing.
So it's not about calculating happiness points, it's about sticking to your moral code, even if it leads to less than ideal outcomes in some situations.
Exactly. It's about the principle of the thing. The source gives an interesting example. Someone finding a wallet full of cash. A consequentialist might say, hey, if keeping this money brings me more happiness than it would the owner, it's the right thing to do.
Right, finders keepers, right, utilitarianism in action.
Exactly. But a deontologist would probably say that returning the wallet is the right thing to do, regardless of any potential benefits, because it upholds the principle of honesty.
It's fascinating how different those two approaches are. But if we're being really honest with ourselves, don't we all kind of bounce between those two impulses in our own lives? Like, sometimes we follow the rules, and sometimes we bend them, depending on the situation. It makes you realize that morality isn't just some abstract concept. It's woven into those everyday decisions we make, often subconsciously.
Absolutely. And this is where the labyrinth of morality throws another wrench into the works. The concept of moral luck.
Moral luck. Okay, now you've got my attention. I've never heard that term before. What's that all about?
So imagine 2 people, right? Very similar upbringings, very similar moral compasses, and they both find themselves in a situation where they have to make a really difficult ethical choice.
Okay, I'm following so far. Similar people, similar dilemmas. What happens next?
Well, one makes a choice that leads to a positive outcome. Everyone's happy, right? But the other person, they make almost the exact same choice. But because of factors totally outside their control, bad luck, you could say, blows up in their face, leads to a negative outcome.
So you're saying that sometimes it's not even about the choices we make, it's about the hand we're dealt. That seems a little unfair, doesn't it?
That's exactly the point the source is raising. It suggests that factors like how we were raised, our socioeconomic background, even random events, all these things can influence not only the choices we make, but also how other people judge those choices.
So it's like our moral report card is being graded on a bit of a curve, depending on our circumstances.
In a way, yes. And it challenges us to consider how much credit or blame we assign to individuals when all these external factors play such a significant role in shaping their choices and their outcomes.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. I mean, on the one hand, it makes you think twice about judging someone's actions without understanding the full context of their life, their experiences. But on the other hand, if everything boils down to luck, good or bad, does that let us off the hook when it comes to personal responsibility? Like, if a bad thing happens because of a choice I made, but it was influenced by factors outside my control, am I still accountable?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And thankfully, the labyrinth of morality doesn't shy away from those tough questions. It presents moral luck, not as a way to excuse unethical behavior, but rather as a way to encourage a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of why people make the choices they do. It's about recognizing those shades of gray in a world that often seems determined to paint everything in black and white.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? We've got this smorgasbord of moral frameworks, absolutism, relativism, consequentialism, deontology, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. And now we've got this concept of moral luck thrown into the mix, reminding us that things are rarely as straightforward as they seem. How do we even begin to apply all of this to the real world? Okay, so we've got all these moral frameworks swirling around in our heads, this idea of moral luck, adding another layer of complexity. It's a lot to process. But how does all this theory actually play out in the real world? Like, how do these ideas influence the choices we make every day, both individually and as a society?
That's where the labyrinth of morality really shines, I think. It doesn't just leave us lost in a maze of abstract concepts. It connects those concepts to real-world issues, the kind of stuff we're all grappling with today.
Okay, so give me an example. What specific issues does the source tackle?
Well, it dives headfirst into bioethics, for one. We're talking about the ethical dilemmas surrounding all those cutting-edge advancements in medicine and biotechnology.
So gene editing, cloning, all that.
Exactly. And then there are the issues surrounding end-of-life care, things like that. We're talking about big existential questions about the very definition of life, what it means to be human, that sort of thing.
It's like science fiction is becoming reality right before our eyes, right? We have the technology to manipulate genes, potentially even create life in a lab, but the question is, should we? Where do we draw the line?
Precisely. And what I appreciate about the Labyrinth of Morality is that it doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It presents different ethical perspectives on these complex issues, encourages us to grapple with them.
So, what are some of those perspectives? Like, how do different moral frameworks approach something like gene editing, for instance?
Well, you could definitely approach it from a utilitarian perspective. The greatest good for the greatest number, right?
Yeah.
If we have the ability to eliminate genetic diseases, enhance human capabilities, wouldn't that lead to a better future for humanity as a whole?
It sounds like a noble goal, aiming for a world without genetic disease. But I imagine there are other ways to look at it.
Absolutely. Some people, often from a deontological standpoint, worry about the potential consequences of tampering with the very building blocks of life. Unintended consequences, things we haven't even thought of yet.
Right, like what about the idea of designer babies? Are we comfortable with the idea of parents choosing their children's traits?
Yeah.
And then there are the potential implications for future generations. It's a lot of responsibility to shoulder.
Exactly. And that brings us to another major theme. The source explores environmental ethics.
Okay, yeah, that's a big one these days. With climate change, ecological crises, it's hard to ignore the ethical implications there.
No kidding. The Labyrinth of Morality really challenges us to think about our responsibilities to the planet, to future generations. Do we have a moral imperative to act now, even if the most severe consequences of inaction might not be felt for decades or even centuries? It's about recognizing that our choices today have ripple effects that extend far beyond our own lifespans.
Right, it's like that saying, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this whole conversation about our ethical responsibilities extends beyond humanity as well. The source delves into the debate surrounding animal rights, for instance.
Oh yeah, that's a hot topic these days. More and more people are questioning our treatment of animals, especially those raised for food in factory farm conditions. It's like, do animals have inherent rights? And if so, how do we balance those rights against our own needs?
Tough questions, for sure. And that leads us to another crucial aspect of applied ethics, that the source doesn't shy away from social justice.
So we're talking about issues of equality, fairness, systemic injustices.
Exactly.
Huh.
Issues like racial injustice, gender inequality, economic disparity, the list goes on. And the Labyrinth of Morality argues that any conversation about morality is incomplete if it doesn't address these systemic issues, these power imbalances that shape our world.
It's about recognizing that morality isn't just about individual choices. It's about the very fabric of society, the systems we create and perpetuate, right?
Exactly. And as we navigate all of this, the bioethics, the environmental concerns, the social justice issues, we're bound to run into those gray areas, those ethical dilemmas, where there's no easy answer, no clear-cut right or wrong.
It's like the source is saying get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Because these aren't easy conversations to have.
No, they're not. But they're crucial conversations. And I think one of the most important things the Labyrinth of Morality emphasizes is the importance of open-mindedness, of respectful dialogue, even when, maybe especially when, we disagree with each other.
It's about approaching these complex issues with a healthy dose of humility, right? Recognizing that none of us has all the answers and that our understanding of morality, of right and wrong, is always evolving.
Well said. And that's something I hope our listeners will take away from this deep dive. Keep asking those tough questions. Challenge your own assumptions. Engage in those difficult conversations with empathy and a willingness to listen. The journey through the Labyrinth of Morality is an ongoing one, full of twists, turns, and unexpected revelations. It's a journey worth taking.
It definitely is. And on that note, we're going to have to leave our listeners to contemplate these big ideas. It's been quite a deep dive into the heart of morality. Until next time, keep those ethical dilemmas coming, keep those conversations going, and remember, there's always more to explore in the labyrinth.